Hi, I'm Emilynetsai on social media. This is a special Sewing Weekender podcast. On Sew Organised Style podcast, I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast and pay respects to the elders past and present. Thanks to everyone who's at the Sewing Weekender this year. It's really great to have you here. This is a special Sewing Weekender podcast featuring two of the Chatty video people who you'll get to see and hear from. Michelle.a.sews and Emily of Emilynetsai are the two Chatty video guests that we've got on this podcast. Welcome to the Sewing Weekender podcast, Emily.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Emily, is this the first time that you've presented at the Sewing Weekender?
It is, yes. It's the first time I've been involved, so I'm quite excited. I've not attended before either, so I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone else's contribution.
That's good. It is a really full weekend and there are a lot of people who are presenting.
Yeah.
And you're one of the Chatty video presenters. That's why you're on this particular podcast. So thank you for being here. Now let's step back. Tell us about your sewing background.
Gosh, I'm not sure when I started. Probably like 6 or 7 years ago when I was living in London, and I did a little bit of sewing then. But at that point, I'd say, probably longer than that. But at that point, I'd say most of the patterns available were the big four patterns, and the kind of rockabilly style was quite big at the time. I didn't find it as accessible at that point. And then I was living in Australia. My housemate had a sewing machine, and then I started looking into it again, and the sort of world of Instagram sewing had kind of really kicked off at that point. So there was a lot more indie patterns, and that's what got me into it more consistently. So that was about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, 3.5 years ago.
I mean, personally, I'm really pleased that you took up sewing more when you were here in Australia because I'm in Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because Peppermint magazine has so many of the free ones as well. And then I was in Melbourne, so I was always popping into the fabric store, and they've got such a lovely range of stuff there.
Oh, that's so good to hear that you picked up sewing more when you were in Melbourne and you've kept going with your sewing too.
It was just the real go-to throughout the lockdowns. It was just, something I could kind of do consistently that wasn't going to be disrupted by all the different changes of being in and out of lockdown, and also moving back to the UK. Yeah, it's just been a really nice thing to turn to, and so has the sewing community as well.
And how do you find sharing your handmade wardrobe on Instagram? What's that like for you?
I lurked for quite a while, just watching what other people were doing, and I realised that I was looking more than I was making myself, and what was holding me back was perfectionism. So I decided that I would start an account just to actually engage, learn more, and just finish projects rather than worry about them being perfect. And I think it was a really kind of worthwhile process because obviously there's more feedback available and help. And yeah, I've just kind of gained momentum from doing that. And yeah, so it's really changed my relationship with my making and creative process.
Do you still have that perfection goal?
No, it was never a goal. It was more just I'm sure I've read a quote about perfectionism being some form of procrastination. So yeah, it was more just a kind of personality trait, I suppose, where I was over scrutinizing what I was doing. And there's still elements of it that comes in, but I'm learning to address my kind of self-talk and be much more forgiving, because most of the time I feel, what I've made is still of a better quality than what I would have access to in terms of buying. Obviously, There's really beautiful clothes that you can make, and I don't want to discredit anybody's work who does make the clothes for the garments. It's just that when you can take the time, you can do much more clean finishes and really look at the details when you do it yourself, tailor it to your own taste.
Is Instagram the only place where we can find you online?
At the moment, yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I might branch out at some point, but yeah, it's really just about kind of sharing some of the images. But I really enjoyed making the video for the sewing weekend. Are always fun to talk about sewing, so I might branch out.
What can we look forward to seeing you talk about at the Sewing Weekend, and now that you've mentioned it?
So I'm talking about my most visited patterns, the ones that I've made the most garments from. So I've listed my top three. One is the Emilynetsai's Cynthia shirt, and it's just because I already have that pattern. I just found that it works really well for me. So I've got into shirt making more recently, and I've been really enjoying that. And then the other two are the Pomona pants and shorts pattern, and the by Anna Allen clothing, and the LB pullover by Paper Theory. So I'd say with the pants and the top, that's become a bit of a uniform, I suppose. They're just two patterns that I feel work really well together and I enjoy making, but they're quite satisfying.
Now that you've got your three main patterns or your top three patterns, does that help with how you develop new clothes in the future?
I'd say the LB pullover's been, I don't know why, it's such a simple pattern, but I think the details are very subtle. There's just some slight kind of curves in terms of how like the shoulder seam moves and kind of flows down the arm, and I feel that it just fits the body in a way that it moves with you. So even though it's kind of loose, it's not too boxy, because some boxy patterns I feel, they don't move with the body.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say the LB pullover's been great because I've hacked it as a top, I've made it as a dress a couple of times, or I've just used it as a kind of template just to check other patterns. I would like to learn more about drafting properly at some point, but as I go to, it's a good reference point. And
I think you're building your skills at a rate that you're happy with, and that's important for long-term sewing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the LB pullover is one that I purchased early on in my journey after Australia, and I made this one a few weeks ago, so I'm still using it.
It's a great fit, and I know listeners will be able to see you wear that because it's on your Instagram feed.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for being on the Sewing Weekender podcast today.
Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for coming onto the podcast for the Sewing Weekender.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It's always good to meet new faces that are at the Sewing Weekender. And I'm assuming this is your first time you've been presenting at the Sewing Weekender.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And I'm so excited. I had wanted to attend the Sewing Weekender when it was a physical event. And for various reasons, I just wasn't able to make it. So I first attended it as an online event. And I just thought it was such a great event, such a variety of content. And I always particularly enjoyed those sort of informal sewing chats with various makers. So I'm really excited to be doing one of my own this time around.
That's great. I know I was in the same boat, other than the fact that I live in Australia and I couldn't be there.
It's a bit far to come.
Quite. And it was always good to see that they would have people who would come to chat. So it wasn't just sewing, it was the interaction as well.
Yeah.
So let's step back now. Tell us about your sewing background, Michelle.
Yeah, sure. So I've been sewing for about 7 years, and I'd say I'm largely self-taught by way of sort of books and the internet and a few targeted short courses for specific skills that I wanted to acquire. I've really been just sort of hooked on sewing since I started, but more recently my sewing time has dwindled. So my output definitely isn't what it used to be. I mainly sew for my working wardrobe, which is sort of business casual, smart casual, a little bit of formal wear for specific events. And in the last couple of years, I've kind of broadened my horizon somewhat to include more casual wear just because of the circumstances. But yeah, I'm very much hooked on sewing.
So tell us about Michelle.a.sews patterns.
Yeah, sure. Michelle.a.sews patterns. Well, it's a line of what I would call contemporary classic sewing patterns. So the garments are geared towards business casual, smart casual settings with really simple classic lines and the kind of things that I hope become wardrobe staples and that people will be able to sew over and over again in different fabrics to make up either a professional working wardrobe for an office setting, which is sort of, where it came from my perspective, or just general sort of day-to-day smart casual wear.
I know that from my perspective, it's good to have some tried and tested basic patterns to get you through, what you need for a working wardrobe or a casual working wardrobe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I first started sewing, I was drawn to sort of the indie pattern brands rather than the big four because, they're a bit intimidating if you haven't, had an extensive background in sewing. But I struggled to find those kind of, to find the patterns for the kind of things that I wanted to wear to work. And so when I did find them, or when I drafted them for myself, I found that they were really very repeatable, and know that I have, as I have today, 10 pencil skirts from the same pattern.
Yeah.
Because that's what wardrobe classics are, really, from my perspective at least.
And the word classic, that's what it describes, the sort of style that you've created and that you're going to, I hope, keep creating. So in terms of, your patterns, what have you got coming up in your pipeline?
Next up in the pipeline is a re-release of a sewing pattern from my archives, which is the Agnes skirt sewing pattern. It's I'll use the word classic again, but it's a classic pencil skirt. It's fully lined. It's got some beautiful features inside and out, with 2 variations, one with pockets and one without. And it's sort of been revamped in line with our current pattern production procedures. So it's been through sort of a technical edit. It's got improved instructions, new photographs for the instructions, and so on. So I'm really looking forward to getting that back out, because it's something that people ask me about on a regular basis. And then behind the Agnes skirt, there's also in the pipeline a tweed jacket sewing pattern, which I'm really excited about, because I've been wearing the sample sort of to death and it really just fits nicely into a professional working wardrobe. So I hope that will be something that people are excited to make and wear for themselves as well.
It sounds like 2 lovely pieces for a working wardrobe, whether it's office or not office.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
Fingers crossed. Now, I think you're onto something here. In terms of your personal sewing projects, what's next on your sewing table?
It's funny, because I am actually due to make another couple of Agnes pencil skirts for myself. I'm also in a bit of a trouser phase, because as a result of, the last couple of years, I've found that I'm really struggling to fit into my existing wardrobe bottoms, my skirts and trousers and dresses as well, because I tend to lean towards quite a fitted silhouette anyway, which is great when it works. And then when your sort of body size fluctuates, it's less helpful for me. Yeah, I'm sort of replenishing my working wardrobe with skirts and trousers, I think, over the next couple of months.
At the end of the day, the fact that you're doing this work means that you're going to have a wardrobe that fits you really well and that you're comfortable to wear all the time.
Yes, I feel more put together and more confident in things that fit me well.
Yeah.
So much so that since I started sewing and I really became so much more conscious of fit, it's been really hard to go back to sort of buying ready to wear and the go-to brands that I used to shop from before I started sewing. To be fair, which was also before my body changed over the last few years. But I find it hard to buy from them now, because I'm really conscious of how things are fitting or not fitting particularly well. And I just have such a low tolerance now for bad fit that I'd rather rewear the same black skirt 3 days out of my 5-day week than compromise on fit.
You actually touched on a point where you want to be able to wear clothes that fit well, because that gives you confidence to get on with your day.
Yeah.
I think that's the key that you've touched on, rather than, you can't get ready to wear to fit you. It's you being able to make clothes fit you to give you that confidence to just go ahead and do what you need to do.
It's confidence and comfort, actually. It's amazing how much more comfortable clothes are when they fit you well. And sometimes you don't have to make big sweeping changes to achieve. When I try something on ready to wear, I can now identify what it is that makes it uncomfortable. And it's often not something huge. I might think to myself, if I could just shorten the bodice on this, it would actually fit me much better and it would be sitting in a more comfortable position on my waist, or something like that. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think good fit just goes such a long way.
Michelle, this has all been really great to discuss with you. And I know people from the Sewing Weekender are going to want to find out more about you. So where can we find you online?
So you can find Michelle.a.sews patterns on Instagram with the username at Michelle.sews_patterns. And I have an account for my personal sewing projects, which is at Michelle.a.sews. And I love to connect with people on Instagram. I think it's one of the things that made Instagram great from a sort of sewing perspective. When I first started sewing, I just love that sewing community. And despite the algorithm, I'm sort of clinging on to that sense of community from the app at the moment. But you can also find my patterns and my sewing blog online at Michelle.sews.com.
And so before we leave and let people get on with the Sewing Weekender, because that's what we're here for.
Yeah.
What can we look forward to seeing you talk at the Sewing Weekender today?
I have contributed one of the informal chats with makers. So I'm essentially talking about my sewing background and what it is that I still enjoy to this day about sewing and the sewing community. So it's a bit of a rambling love letter to sewing and the sewing community.
I think that's wonderful. Thank you for coming onto the podcast for the Chatty video episode for the Sewing Weekender.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great.
And enjoy the Sewing Weekender, everyone.
Yes, enjoy it, everyone. Happy sewing. Before we finish, make sure you keep up with this weekend's fun by following the hashtag Sewing Weekender on Instagram. We're all really excited to have you at the online Sewing Weekender because it's happening right now. This episode of Sew Organised Style podcast for the Sewing Weekender 2022 was produced by me, Maria Theoharis, with permission of Michelle and Emily, as well as the permission and support of Rachel, Kate and Charlotte. You can subscribe to Sew Organised Style podcast, but with an S, not a Z, on all good podcast apps. Thank you again for supporting the Sewing Weekender and for listening to this special podcast. We hope you'll learn some new sewing skills, hear from industry experts and engage with other sewers. You're among friends.